The new TFT set is finally here. Set 14 Cyber City has dropped, where you can defend the future of your city with a team of superheroes, villains, hackers, vigilantes, and even a crime syndicate ring. It's the usual silly TFT set with a lot of fun flavor, new mechanics, traits, abilities, so on and so forth. But the big question remains, what are the best comps? 2 weeks before the official set launch, Riot always puts the new set onto the public beta server so that they can flesh out bugs and a bunch of balance changes. Over those 2 weeks, I grinded over 150 games, studied a bunch of stats, played in pro scrims, and my main study partner was TFT Academy's very own two-time world champion Disso. Together, we came up with the best 8 comps that you should know going to launch week so that you can succeed in your rank climb. So let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list and find out what those comps are. Whether you're a new or returning player, here are 3 things that every player should know before they play their first game of Set 14. The first is that this set will have more resources than ever before. It's a lot like Set 11 encounters where you just get a bunch of gold, a bunch of items, and you should be able to hit your endgame cap board state very often. That does mean that on average, it'll look like everyone is high rolling. So you're going to have boards that look like it should be a first, but it's oftentimes like a third or a fourth, and you're going to be kind of confused. That also means that on average, you should be looking to get to 9 every game if you're playing around 4 cost. Getting stuck on level 8 means that you're probably just going to be playing for top 4. If you're a reroll comp, look to 3-star unit pretty quickly and then push levels to end your game with 5 costs as opposed to staying lower level and roll for more 3-stars. There are exceptions to that, but that's the general rule of thumb. The big thing here that I want to shout out is hacked augments, especially that ones that give you bonus gold at the beginning of the game. At the beginning of the game, people usually take an econ augment so they can get their gold stacking early, but if you get a combat augment that gives you 2-1-10 gold that helps you win, you might be able to snowball that, and it'll be as if you took an econ augment that has a combat scaling throughout the rest of the game. So at the beginning of the game, if you see that bonus gold augment, consider taking that almost over anything else that you can see. This level 8 board, for example, even they 2-star everything, oftentimes isn't high cap enough to match everything else that went to level 9. So you're going to be seeing boards like this fizzle out, even though it looks really cracked. Tip number 2, every backline item has 2 4-cost carries that can hold it. Flexibility is pretty high with itemization, so that does mean that you can slam them pretty aggressively and figuring it out later. You don't have to just say, I have Rageblade, I can only play Twitch. That was true last set. This set, you slam Rageblade, you can play Aphelios, you can play Xayah, you can even put on some 5 costs. There is one exception though. There's only one 4-cost melee carry in Zed, which means slamming melee items is much worse and committal this set, and you have to know exactly what you're doing with it. Melee items, if you don't know, are things like Bloodthirsters, Titan Resolve, Hand of Justice, Stagger's Gauge, Edge of Night, so on and so forth. Here's a quick tier list on what are the good item holders for each of these items. The best Shojin holders are Xayah, MF, Brand, and Ziggs. If you do end up putting things like Shojin on Annie and Vex, they're not bad, but they're just not optimal. Instead, Annie and Vex prefer blue buff, and the trade-off is good units with Shojin like Ziggs don't really hold it nearly as well. But it's okay, and you have to just make do with what you got. And then the base Rageblade holders are Aphelios and Zeri. You can always put them on 5 costs like Renekton and Urgot. And you could put them on other units like Xayah, Ziggs, and Brand as a replacement for Shojin, but it's significantly worse. So we're skipping A and going straight to C for it. Tip number 3, plan for a duo carry or a trio carry every game. A lot of times in TFT, you're always saying, oh, I'm playing a certain unit as a composition. I'm playing Aphelios or I'm playing Shaco this comp. But you actually have to think about your duo carry in every instance. It's not just Aphelios, it's Aphelios and Xayah. It's not just Reroll Shaco, it's Shaco 3, and then eventually you get to Senna or Zed as additional Slayer. And then every now and then, probably 1 every 4 games, you're going to get enough resources for a trio carry setup if you survive late in the game. And that's going to be doubly so when it's a high resource portal like Scuttle Puddle. This usually means that your trio carry is going to be a 5 cost, and like we said before, that's where the melee items can go, and that usually ends up being the case because it's really hard to get like a 3rd Shojin, a 3rd Rageblade, or a 3rd blue buff of some kind. So you end up just having melee items, you slam things like Bloodthirster and Titans and Hand of Justice, and that ends up just going on some kind of 5-cost unit. In this examples, we had the items on Viego, but you could also put items on Garen. Kabuko is actually kind of a melee carry, as well as Renekton. If you want to see this is going to be on the new feature of TFT Academy, the guides pages, where you can look at other things such as how to play certain comps, guides to items, as well as specific augments. All right, enough yapping. Let's go ahead and find out what the best comps are. The number 1 comp that dominated PB going to the set launch is Divinicorp Zed. Divinicorp is the trait similar to Guild from Set 7 Dragonlands and Set 11 Inkborn Fables with Heavenly. For each separate individual Divinicorp you add to the unit, your team gets a separate bonus stat. When you add in Ross, for example, you get a bunch of resistances. When you add in Gragas, your team gets a bunch of HP. When you add Vex, your team gets a bunch of crit chance. When you add Senna, you get a bunch of AD, so on and so forth for the rest of the trait. The reason why it works really well with Zed is because Zed, when he gets so many stats, ends up becoming a 1v9 hyper carry and is unstoppable when you're able to assemble the best possible items on him. Because of all the extra stats, he becomes unkillable, and if you're able to put Garen God of the Net on him, which mods him into Divinicorp, you don't even need the Divinicorp emblem. So a lot of times what ends up happening is you build 2 items on Zed and you get the Divinicorp emblem on him, but then once you get the mod from Garen, it pops the Divinicorp emblem off, and then you can go for a 3rd item. This is basically like putting 4 items on Zed. That being said, you don't need the emblem 100%. You could also just play without the Divinicorp emblem. It's just that 7 Divinicorp is the highest cap that you can get with him. The other traits that you want to think about is Slayer. Slayer gives a bunch of attack damage as well as Omnivamp to heal up. And you might notice that we have Bloodthirster and Hand of Justice as 2 healing items for Zed as well. You also can go for a defensive item like Edge of Night on Zed because sometimes he just gets bursted by really high DPS champions from the enemy backline. But the reality is Zed also throws a shuriken and TPs away, so he actually has some built-in evasion into his kit. So he's just kind of a nightmare to deal with. And then you factor in the duo and trio carries. In this case, we're going to have Senna hold a bunch of attack damage items. Things like Last Whisper just helps Thunder, Infinity Edge to amplify her crits, and Runaan's Hurricane works really well with Senna because she has such high base attack damage just due to her Slayer trait. The other aspect that's really powerful to this composition is Renekton. Renekton is not just a Divinicorp Bash unit, but he also has a trait called Overlord. Overlord allows you to consume a friendly unit and gain its stats. Renekton likes to eat units that have high base attack damage like Senna, and Senna has a bunch of extra bonus stats thanks to things like Gragas with the Divinicorp buff, as well as the rest of the team buff. And so what ends up happening is Renekton ends up getting a ton of extra stats and ends up becoming like a trio carry with very little investment. That can also be another AP carry if you get extra items like a blue buff, a death cap, a Morello, Shiv, things like that. You can always just throw extra AP because sometimes you don't know what to do with all those tiers and rods. And the crazy thing is, you don't really need tank items. You have your utility through Last Whisper Morello, and you can just go balls to the wall aggression. This is a really popular composition that China played all throughout a bunch of pro scrims, so definitely keep an eye out for it. And the number one thing to think about is making sure you have the economy to be able to support it, because you're going to be rolling a lot of gold on level 8 trying to get to Zed and Vex and ultimately get to 9 for Renekton. An early game that you can play around it is Shaco. Shaco, if you have upgrades, can just hold Zed's items and, hold things like Infinity Edge, Hand of Justice, and Bloodthirster, Edge of Night. And then you can also have Vayne hold the Senna items. So it has a really good complementary frontline and backline similar to the setup here. And Shaco also ends up snowballing as well. And maybe in the best case scenario, you end up hitting Shaco 3. Guess what? Maybe you just play Slayer Reroll Shaco instead. Let's say you end up getting Vayne 3. You can also just transition to a Vayne carry as well. So there's a lot of different pivot options you have, depending on what you end up hitting, and this composition has many different outs. So you do have some flexibility in terms of what you can play if you are overly contested and you don't have any other options. But for the most part, you should still be very stable, even if you have Z1, as long as you can get to Z2 by somewhere in Stage 5. Composition number 2 that's absolutely crushing everything in the pro scrims is Strategist AMP, featuring Annie as a primary carry. There's 2 things to pay attention to this comp that I want to point out. The first is that this playstyle is fast 9, meaning that you're going to try to skip level 8 as much as you can, roll minimally, and get to 9 with a bunch of gold, and try to stabilize around 5 cost. And you might think that's really impractical, but this set, as we talked about, gives you way more resources than usual. So you should be able to actually get to 9 a lot more reasonably if you have the spot for it. And of course, if you have like good econ augments, level up, upper mobility, slam in, and a bunch of other econ augments help get you there. Also, this makes sense too if you're playing on high resource portals such as Scuttle Puddle and Crab Rave to give you a bunch of extra resources. The second most important thing is that Annie really requires these specific mana items. She really wants blue buff, Nashers, and Shojin, which sounds like too much mana, but the reality is she ends up both being your damage and helping your frontline because she summons the Tibbers with her cast, and that ends up being another form of tankiness. And so having her spam cast is a really important element of this composition. As such, whenever you can get something that just gives you a blue buff, or if you are able to force your components like a Pandora's or a component Anvil start, just consider playing around Annie if you have the AP opener. The 5 costs in this composition are pretty flexible. Kabuko is the best 5 cost to play around, and you absolutely want to activate his Cyberboss bonus. Kabuko might be the best 5 cost in the game, but it's only if he has Cyberboss active, because then he hits 2 hex radius. 1 hex radius is just around here. He wouldn't hit any units around him. 2 hex radius, you start reaching pretty close to their backline even at times. And so Kabuko becomes twice as effective when he gets a cyber buff. Samira takes leftover AD. She is nerfed for the live patch. So all the scrims that we had was before Samira went from 3 bullets to 2 off her amp scaling. So she's worse. If you don't know what amp scaling is, just another separate resource scaling mechanism. You can scale off ability magic damage. You can scale off of attack physical damage. Amp is just like a separate scaling trait. If you get more amp, you get more bullets for Samira. If you get more amp, you get more fireballs for Annie. You get more amp, you get more passive mana per second. So it's just like a fun little scaling lever that they can pull on some of these champions. It's a unique thing. So they did nerf Samira, but she's still really good with AD. If you're able to get her with a bunch of crit in particular, she just does a huge wide AoE. She smashes everything. And then the third legendary I want to call out is Viego. I think this guy is kind of a force. If he's able to get to 2-star, he ends up doing an amazing amount of AoE. A fantastic Morello holder. He really wants Edge of Night, Hand of Justice, Jewel Gauntlet, Morello, things like that. The thing about Fast 9 that I think people don't understand is that it's not that you like don't ever roll on level 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's just that you have to spend minimal amounts of gold and being efficient while winning fights. You have to win those fights, or at least preserve a lot of HP so that you can get to 9 and roll with, at least like 50, 60, 70 gold. And I would say that's undershooting it, because even if you roll down 60, 70 gold, you're expected to hit one of those 5 costs. And so if you're trying to hit multiple 5 costs, Annie 2, and you're still looking for other upgrades like, Nico 2, maybe finding things like Mordekaiser and Ziggs, you're just going to be really poor if you're rolling 50, 60. And so that's why ultimately Fast 9 is a really hard playstyle. But if you love going for those crazy win out comps, this is a composition that once you hit everything, you can win every fight for the rest of the game. So you get to 9, lose a couple of fights, and you hit Samira 2, Annie 2, Kabuko 2, throw items on Viego, go for that trio carry setup, and then you'll be good to go. It is possible that because they buffed Ziggs for the live patch, by the time this video recording, you might actually see Ziggs be a duo carry as well, which would be a really big quality of life. It makes it less important to hit the 5 costs. That does also make it difficult because he's fighting for the same items as Annie, like basically wants like Shojin and other tier/rod items. And the other thing I want to give a shout out is that I do think that if you get Lichbane is actually quite amazing on Yuumi with blue buff. I actually had a fun little highlight video where Yuumi was just machine gunning everything down. And that's another way that you can actually Fast 9. You can actually just play like something like blue buff, Yuumi with maybe a Nashor's or a Gunblade. And you don't have to roll very much because you have Yuumi 2 and you're able to get to level 9 that way. There's a lot of fun tricks that you can use to try to skip level 8 being very efficient. Yuumi 2 being one of them. Annie with Mana Zane being another. The strongest reroll comp on PB was Nitro. And Nitro Reroll is a summon-based trait where each star level that you get will scale this robot further. If you hit 200 stacks, it transforms from a robot into a dinosaur. It does big AoE, it tanks, pushes out a ton of damage, and is generally kind of a menace. It's like your tank and your carry alongside whatever you reroll. There's a couple different reroll variations. The one that dominated the most on PB was Jin. And that's because they kind of overbuffed Jin. He was doing really badly. And then when they buffed him too much, he became too strong. And you play like the Exotech package with him. But that got nerfed right before the set started. So I believe this will be the strongest version of Nitro, which is around Veigar reroll. Best in slot Veigar is blue buff, Nashor's, and Gunblade. If you can't get blue buff, Shojin is acceptable, but it's just a little bit worse. And if you can't get out of them, Adaptive Helm is also something that you can probably get. And you pretty much use Shyvana as your main tank. She's going to hold Redemption and Spark. The Redemption is really important because it heals the dinosaur and gives it durability. And then Spark is because the damage done by the T-Rex and your entire comp is magic damage. Even if you're playing the Jin variation, you still want to have Spark because it still shreds for the T-Rex. The really cool thing about Nitro is that it actually has a bunch of different options to extend the comp. So the first is for Cyberboss. If you can get Kabuko. Kabuko is just one of the best 5 costs in the game, which we'll talk about later on in a bunch of other comps. Kabuko is damage, CC, and AoE, and he is very versatile. If you get 4 Cyberboss, it is quite good. And you want to still make Veigar the Cyberboss. Even though you have Kabuko too, I still think you want to choose Veigar as the Mega Boss. You also could have a trio carry with Elise, for example, and have Elise 3 be holding extra AP items. And that's only if you are very, very rich, though. It's going to be kind of impractical to get to Elise 3 in a lot of situations because you're rolling for Vhagar and you just can't really hold Nidalee, Kindred, Vhagar, Shyvana all on your bench and go for Elise 3. You're going to run into some bench management issues. You could also put items on Ziggs. They buffed him right before live. Ziggs was struggling a little bit on PBE, so I wouldn't 100% recommend it in full confidence, but there's a chance that he's a lot better now. And you can always extend this composition as well on 9 by playing Aurora in the back or just playing another 5-cost like Garen and then trying to use God of the Net with some modifications. Vhagar also is pretty powerful with some of these artifacts. Mana Zane replaces the mana, so you don't really need it as much with like Nashers, for example. If you have Lichbane, that also replaces Nashers. And if you have Deathfire Grasp, I guess that also replaces Nashers. Nashers is just like a combo item, so you're just probably going to replace that the first item if you could. Items on Kindred fall off really quickly. I think Kindred falls off on stage 3, so if you do end up putting anything on Kindred, just keep in mind you have to move it off. Then Nidalee is also respectable at times, but I do think that Nidalee, she uses a lot of AP melee, so it's like Jewel Gauntlet, Bloodthirsters, Edge of Night, Titans. But the problem with Nidalee is that she also falls off without a bunch of AMP, and this is just not the comp that scales into AMP. But it's possible that you end up playing more AMP. It's just that you're going to be indexed way too much on backline because all the AMP units like Annie, Yuumi, and Samira are all backline units. The augments that really push you forward are things that help you reroll. So Pandora's Bench, Starry Night, and Shop Glitch are all things that are really good. You could play No Scout, No Pivot with this composition because it's really easy to just lock in the 3 Nitro plus Vhagar early so you can get the stacks. And then if you get stuff like Polished Chrome and Spare Bards, especially if it gives you bonus gold, like we talked about, the hacked augments, it's definitely worth taking and just forcing. This composition cannot really be contested though, so if you do see someone else trying to play Reroll Nitro, I would suggest just playing this as a tempo line, meaning you're going to just go for 2-star Vhagar, 2-star Kindred, 2-star Shyvana, and you're not going to try to reroll for 3 stars. Just play it for strong early mid game, then transition to some other 4-cost and 5-cost carry. It's just not worth trying to contest somebody for all those 3 stars because then both of you are going to bot for. The third comp that's also challenging for the most popular is Marksman Vanguard, featuring Aphelios and Xayah duo carry. This composition actually got nerfed right before the set launched because it was just too stable, and it's a very basic fastball, 95 mile an hour down the middle of the plate, and if you can't keep up with it, then you just can't kind of get bowled over. This composition is pretty much as straightforward as it gets. It's just a standard 4 Vanguards, 4 Marksmen in the back. You have Anima Squad with Silas, Leona, and Xayah, and you have Golden Ox with Jarvan and Aphelios. So a couple of linking traits there. And then it's just a straightforward front to back composition where it just slowly but surely whittles down the front and tries to get to the enemy backline through overwhelming force. The most important item in this composition is Rageblade for Aphelios. A lot of people try to primary carry Xayah, but it hasn't been very successful. And that's because I think Xayah is much better as the secondary cleanup crew where the pressure is off her to deal the most amount of damage. Xayah just ends up struggling a lot to kill really meaty front lines. You're going to run into things like 4 or 6 Vanguard, 4 or 6 Bastion, 6 Bruiser, and Xayah can't primary carry, but Aphelios can. And that's because he ramps with this Rage Blade, and he's also ramping with Golden Ox. This trait is really important for you to ramp up. This is the secret reason of why Aphelios is really good. If you don't understand Golden Ox, the quickest summary I can give is that once per turn, you can spend gold to permanently upgrade your damage amp. It does increase every single time you do it though, so you spend 8 gold the first time either on rerolling leveling, the next time is going to cost 12, the next time is going to cost 16, because if it was just 8 gold every single time, that'd be super broken. That being said, it is kind of still broken. This actually is one of the best 2-piece trades they've ever made for carries. And you also can carry early game with it as well. Like if you have Graves instead of this Jhin recommendation, you can just farm early Golden Ox and start getting the stacks that way. A couple of variations you can play. Instead of Jinx and Jhin, you can play for 6 Vanguard. You can just simply replace these 2 units with 6 Vanguard. You also don't have to play the Anima Squad if you can't find Xayah. You can play Aphelios, Jhin, and you can play Misfortune, for example, with these exact same items. We're not going to cover it today, but Misfortune uses the exact same items pretty much as Xayah, so you have that flexibility option. But for the most part, 4 Vanguard, 4 Marksmen, really straightforward, or 6 Vanguard, 2 Marksmen. Fastball, 100 miles per hour down the middle of the plate. If you can't keep up to it, you get blown out. Pretty straightforward. It is kind of expensive though, so I do think that some of these econ augments are important because you're rolling for 3-4 costs. And if you're stuck on Leona 1 and you have Aphelios 2, don't be surprised if you still kind of get bowled over because your front line is not good enough. One thing I want to call out is Category 5 is pretty amazing this set, mainly because so many traits just give you a ton of attack damage. And the Runan's bolt, the lightning bolt, actually scales off of how much damage you do. And so in previous sets, they weren't giving you as much AD. This set, there's just so much AD available for the champions that scale, right? Marksman gain even more attack damage every 6 seconds. And so Runan's ends up being really high value. They actually nerfed this going to the live patch because it was too good. But if you do get Category 5, it ends up being a really good secondary build on Aphelios. Fiddlesticks Reroll is probably the highest ceiling reroll composition in the game. If you can get this reroll comp online, you will win a lot of lobbies. The difficult thing is you don't really have many spots you can play for it because, one, it's pretty expensive. Rolling for multiple 3 costs can be very hard to obtain, especially because Mordekaiser might end up being really contested every lobby simply because his traits are very flexible. The second is that Fiddlesticks actually just really wants a ton of the same components. It's actually really hard to get double Archangels. The actual true BIS is 3 Archangels, but pragmatically speaking, you're more likely to play like double Archangels and Jewel Gauntlet. And if you're able to get a Bruiser Emblem on him, it just makes the board fit really cleanly because then you get 6 Bruiser and then you get to squeeze in Renekton and Poppy. Poppy activates the Cyberboss on Kabuko and activates the Bastion on Renekton. It's a little silly playing like a 1 cost just for the synergies, but it's actually really powerful on this board. So if you can get it all together, it ends up being quite good. A few augments I want to call out to help you look for the spots to play a Fiddlesticks game is Cooking Pot. Cooking Pot says that you get scaling HP permanently for the rest of the game for whoever is next to a spatula item. So a really common strategy is to play Fiddlesticks next to an early bruiser like Alistar. Give Alistar just the pan. That's it. Don't actually make the bruiser emblem. And the Alistar will scale the Fiddlesticks. And that's important because if you make the Bruiser emblem, it pops off the Alistar, and then you're forced to put on Fiddlesticks. And then Fiddlesticks, who's holding the Bruiser emblem, will scale something else. And that's a really important interaction because you're going to scale the Fiddlesticks and then give the Bruiser emblem to Fiddlesticks. And then guess what? Fiddlesticks is going to have 6, 7, 8,000 HP and become very unkillable. And the reason why that's important is because if Fiddlesticks has enough defensive ability just through the raw HP, 6, 7, 8,000 HP, then he can't actually get killed. And it's almost like he has his own Edge of Night or his own Zonias or whatever. He just becomes really difficult to deal with. And he has so much time to ramp his double Archangels to absolutely kill everything. Of course, you don't have to do that. Another strategy is just simply to put it on Fiddlesticks and scale another bruiser like Mordekaiser. You can also do that too. But I think that my favorite strategy to play is to go for the bruiser on the Fiddlesticks. Other really good augments to call out, Rig Shop gives you all the 3 costs, and that helps you hit the Mordekaiser and the Fiddlesticks. Heroic Grab Bag is really clutch. Sometimes you just can't even go for anything but the Fiddlesticks 3. Like Mordekaiser is really contested, so Heroic Grab Bag, finish your Fiddlesticks, and then move up. A couple artifacts I want to call out that are particularly exceptional on Fiddlesticks is Blooding Jewel and Sniper's Focus. Sniper Focus is really good because it makes him cast from the back line, and Fiddlesticks will tether to the 3 closest enemies. Sometimes what that means is Fiddlesticks will start in the bottom corner, he'll tether to the enemy front line, and the next closest unit is actually in the back corner because the other half of the board is here. So you're going to get some amazing Sniper's Focus max distance value. So Fiddlesticks can really crush enemy backlines. The second artifact is Blooding Jewel because he ends up doing a drain effect. So every instance of his drain off his tether will end up reducing their magic resistance and basically putting them at complete vulnerability. And then you have to get 5 mana to recast. So it's very, very powerful. These are the 2 best artifacts by far on Fiddlesticks. So they're just some of the conditions that help you find Fiddlesticks. It's not going to be very common that you can play it, but when you do not pass it up because this composition, if everything goes right, is going to be a good first. And I think the reason why it's not S tier is just simply because it's just not forceable and it's really easy to disrupt. Twisted Fate is like the Kog'Maw Reroll of the set, which is really funny because there is actually a Kog'Maw Reroll, but the reason why we call it the Kog'Maw Reroll is that it's like a cheap reroll comp, uses double Rage Blade, uses a bunch of attack speed, uses Gunblade. If you played set 11, this was like Bard, when you played the trick shot Bard with the Mythic and it just went woo. And this is like Kog'Maw with Automata, shooting a bunch of stuff. Or Honey Mancy Kog'Maw as well back in set 12, the Magic and Mayhem set, the Honey Mancy set. It's just, you know, a Rage Blade, high attack speed carry that is trying to bully stage 2 and stage 3, and then parts of stage 4, then basically loses every fight for the rest of the game and cruises to an easy 3rd and 4th. Twisted Fate's a really fun carry because if you turn him into the Kingpin, Kingpin is a special item that you equip. You give a little top hat to Twisted Fate, which is weird because he already has a hat, but hey, I guess I'm not a fashion expert. Twisted Fate will then throw a bunch of cards and deal more AoE, and once in a while throw a yellow card that grants gold, so sometimes he prints gold, and it's a very, very fun unit to play. So you basically have a good front line. You scale your front line through Rage Blade and Gunblade and heal it, and then just watch Twisted Fate bully everything. You want to roll on 6 for this composition. I forgot to mention for Fiddlesticks, you want to roll on 7. But for this composition, you want to roll on 6. We have Darius 3 as the other Kingpin if you play 5 Syndicate. 5 Syndicate gives you the ability to choose 2 Kingpins versus 1. And that's important because it helps make your front line better and gives you 15% extra damage amp. So that's really, really nice. But you don't have to tank Darius at all. You can actually just tank Braum and Skarner even, right? Like anything that you can 3-star, because the reality is you won't be able to always go for things like Braum 3 or even Darius 3. Skarner and Kog'Maw are replaceable. You don't actually have to chase them at all. It's just like a luxury item. Let's say you're playing Starry Night. Well, you want to look for more things to reroll besides just Twisted Fate and maybe Darius. You can go for Skarner 3 and Kog'Maw 3. I mean, hell, throw a Shaco 3 in there. Why not? More clowns to enjoy. But if you're playing something like Caretaker's Ally, where you choose the unit and you get a Twisted Fate every single time you level up, you probably don't even bother rerolling almost anything. And you can just go for like a Leona primary tank and Zeri as a secondary instead of Kog'Maw. Misfortune ends up being your duo carry in a lot of situations. You end up just giving her AD items in Vidi Edge, Last Whisper, Shojin, Guardbreaker, Giant Slayer, things of that sort. In the late stages of the game, you cap out your board a lot of times with Vernekton or Zac or Kabuko, any of the usual 5 costs that help you cap really, really high. One augment I want to shout out as well is I do think this is one of the better anger issues compositions. So if you do end up wandering onto this black market augment, you can get it under certain specific hacked augment scenarios. It is worth going for because I think it's very powerful specifically in this composition. Cyberboss Reroll is also quite good if you have the right setup for it. My favorite setup is new high score. Cyberboss increase their score when they deal damage. When they reach the high score, they get a little bit of permanent attack speed and some bonus rewards. So like extra gold, maybe component, a duplicator. But the cool thing about this is that it also gives you a Ziggs at 75,000 and a Kabuko at 100,000. So if you're able to scale and live long enough, you're guaranteed a Ziggs and Kabuko. You're guaranteed for Cyberboss. You can actually win the game. So I think this augment is incredibly powerful if you have the right setup for it. Because the difficulty is you kind of need to have specific items for Vhagar. You need to really set him up for success with, you know, blue buff as well as Gunblade and some extra AP and mana. You roll on 6 for this composition, and the units you're looking for are Vhagar, Shyvana, and sometimes Poppy and Alawi. Shyvana ends up being like your tank that holds the Kabuko items for a large period of time, and then at the very end of the game, you shift items to Kabuko. In some ways, I feel like we need to probably develop these kinds of guides to show you like what you're playing most of the game, and then at the very end for like the last 3 fights, if you survive there, you get the Kabuko, you transition over from Shyvana to Kabuko, and then Kabuko holds the items. So that's why it looked kind of weird to have like Shyvana 3 or Poppy 3 with almost no items, because the reality is they're going to be holding items for a while, then you transfer over. A couple other things I want to shout out: Manazane, Deathfire Grasp, Lichbane. These are all fantastic artifacts on Vhagar. Kabuko is an absolute menace with Unending Despairs. It is actually just so sick how much damage you can deal. He just gets this big, incredible shield and then just nukes them with Unending Despair, and he gets so much tankiness from it. Really, really powerful combo. Another thing worth mentioning with this composition is that you either play 2 or 4 Cyberboss. You're not really trying to play 3 Cyberboss. It gives you 7% HP and 10 AP. Woohoo! Not really. It's not very impressive. So if you don't have Kabuko and you get Ziggs, you could play Ziggs, I think, at level 7 because you're playing 4 Bastion, Ziggs, and Vhagar. But you can pretty much just play like any other unit that's better. I also like capping the board with 6 Bastion in particular because it's just really cheap. You play 6 Bastion, 4 Cyberboss. That's usually your top end. Another thing you can do is play 4 Techies with Viego. You can just play Viego and Mordekaiser. Or you can always just play some Divinicorp, right? Let's say you get the Renekton, who is a Bastion. You can also play some other Divinicorp units to support. So it's pretty flexible in that sense. And perhaps I should have let off with this, but the most important unit to Cyberboss is Vhagar. Vhagar is the Cyberboss because he just does way more damage in AoE. I would never put a Cyberboss onto Poppy or Ziggs. Maybe Kabuko if you're really looking for some extra flash and pizzazz, but it's always got to be Vhagar. And then the last bonus tip, I promise I'll be done after this, is that he is also a unit that targets adjacent enemies. So this positioning is actually sometimes incorrect. If you read his ability, it says deal magic damage to the current target and magic damage to adjacent enemies. Well, if he's targeting units right here at the top corner, the adjacent enemies is lost on the left-hand side, right? He's not actually targeting anything here, only to like half the value of his AoE. And so sometimes you actually want to move Vhagar out of the corner. The trade-off is when you move him out of the corner, he ends up taking some AoE damage. He's easier to get hit by Sejuani ults and things like that. So it's not always strictly correct to put him in the bottom center. So just keep that in mind. And not everyone positions their units on the edge to counter the Vhagar either. So it's not necessary in a lot of situations. If you don't want to reroll techies, but you just enjoy playing that kind of AP burst-oriented composition, then I would definitely look at Brand and techies. They improved it a lot, and they buffed Brand right before live. Viego is insane late game. If you get 8 techies plus Brand and Viego, you can just burst down AoE a bunch of different compositions that aren't prepared for it. Brand throws a fireball and it explodes within a 2-hex radius. And it's actually really synergistic with Viego, so you kind of want them to be on the same side. And they can basically like cast at the same time, and then all of a sudden, if they clump their backline, they automatically die. So if you're playing composition like Marksman Vanguard and you're going up against tankies, make sure you like Xayah and Aphelios opposite sides so that way they don't get hit by the same Viego and Brand targets. You might be sensing a theme here. Almost every AP line wants to play Kabuko in some capacity here. Kabuko with techies is probably the best holder of it. The only tricky thing about it is that you can't easily get Cyberboss, so it's worse, but it's still worth playing Kabuko because he's Kabuko. He's the best. So play Kabuko. Techies is sorcerers, so the usual good augments. Piercing Lotus, so that way all of your units can crit and you don't need things like Jeweled Lotus. You also don't need to prioritize things like Shiv and Spark as quickly because you get some Shred. Glass Cannons, you get damage amp. Mana Flow, so you get more mana. Blazing Souls, so you get attack speed and ability power. This is all just the usual stuff that's really powerful in a sorcerer-based line. Try to play around Seraphine 2. Seraphine 2 is the best 2-star 1-cost techie early. I do think Zyra does more individual utility because she can stun, but Seraphine can hit a giant AoE and actually kill and punish people for positioning in a clump. And so she ends up being the best brand holder. Plus, if you get 8 techies, she's the one that you cut. So you just sell her, you don't have to waste a remover, and it can transition over to brand. And it is worth mentioning that Nico probably holds all these Kabuko items before you get to Kabuko. And you also can tech in things like Strategist with more Street Demons. So you can kind of have this hybridize into the Street Demon comp, which we're not going to go into today because it's not that good right now on PvE. But you can actually just still play like a 5 Street Demons, 6 techies, and then like wait until you hit things like Viego to transition over into 8 techies. All right, I said that was the 8 comps to pay attention to for launch, but there's actually a bonus other composition to pay attention to, and I think that's Kog'Maw. We put it in B tier because the true placement of this composition is probably in the B tier, but the reality is, for launch week, this is actually the comp I recommend a lot of people to start learning if you are very new to TFT and you just need a simple comp that you can play pretty much every game. I would say it's Kog'Maw Reroll. The stats on it are probably going to look really good for the first week, and it might even be one of those things where the perception of it is really good. In pro scrims, it doesn't actually do that well, but that's because a lot of the pros are like capable of playing all these crazy 4 and 5 cost compositions at level 9 and crushing it. The premise is that you just pretty much play Kog'Maw and Skarner and get to 3-star. You pick things like Starry Night, you pick things like Pandora's Bench, you picked up Misconnections, you pick up things like One for All, and you 3-star pretty much everything. Skarner 3, Kog'Maw 3, Vi 3, Size 3, Ross 3. I mean, you probably can go for also Jarvan 3, and maybe you're just in one of those lobbies where you can just golden everything. Kog'Maw really wants Rageblade, Runins, and Deathblade. If you can't get Deathblade, you can just go for Infinity Edge or Giant Slayer. The reason why Runins is really good is because Runins activates Boombot. Boombot says, fire missile for every 400 damage dealt at a nearby enemy. That damage by Runins actually counts towards the Boombot. So you want things like Runins on Kog'Maw it is very, very good. Zeri ends up being your secondary. She ends up holding a lot of utility, and kind of similar to the T-Hex, the boom bots fire a magic missile, right? Deals magic damage. So you ultimately do want things like Shiv and Spark to amplify that boom bot damage. It's not the end of the world. I wouldn't go out of my way to make something like Shiv. I would care about Last Whisper and Even Shroud way earlier, but it's just something to pay attention to because that's how you min-max those damage. And trust me, Kog'Maw's going to need it because you're going to fall off really hard starting in stage 5. So there you have it, the 8 comps that I would recommend for you to get started on Set 14 Cyber City. I think it has a pretty healthy mix of some fast, medium, and slow comps, aggressive reroll, some standard 4 costs, as well as some greedy fast 9. And of course, it does have a big patch coming into before live that we have minimal testing on, so it might still continue to shift. In fact, I do expect some meta evolution. So where these 8 comps actually line up might actually not even be correct in order, but they are going to be comps that are going to be played early, so hopefully this gets you a head start. And as always, if there are a bunch of changes, we'll make sure to put some more content out to help keep you guys guided so that way you guys aren't completely lost. So make sure to check out TFT Academy so you can always stay up to date on all of the meta. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the streets.